For 12 years, I thought I had everything anyone could ever want. My wife Laura and I had been high school sweethearts. We married young, filled with the excitement of starting a life together, and settled into what seemed like the perfect routine. Our children, a boy and a girl, brought so much joy to our home, and Laura, always the nurturing mother, was deeply involved in their lives. I could never have imagined that there was anything wrong with our marriage, or that my world would one day come crashing down around me. We were the kind of family people admired. A steady home, a loving couple, the American dream in suburban form. Laura was everything you'd want in a wife. She was thoughtful, caring, and seemed to be completely committed to our family. She was the first one up in the mornings, making breakfast, and the last to bed, making sure the kids had everything they needed. As a father, I didn't always understand the emotional weight of those little sacrifices, but I appreciated them. Laura's presence in our home was constant. We spent weekends together as a family, going to the park, attending the kids' school events, and even having simple dinners at the table. She'd always smile and ask about my day, showing genuine interest, making me feel like everything in our life was just as it should be. We had our disagreements like any couple. We argued about money, about the kids' future, and about what to have for dinner. But these arguments were always temporary. We'd make up quickly and move on, never lingering on the small stuff. It was a comfortable life, even if sometimes we took each other for granted. I didn't realize that Laura had started growing distant. I chalked up her quiet moments and lack of enthusiasm as part of the natural ebb and flow of life. Parenting two young kids, managing the house, and keeping up with a busy life, she was just exhausted, I assumed. But I was wrong. She'd started withdrawing little by little. She'd spend more time alone in the evenings, reading or staring out of the window. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd brush it off with a smile, telling me everything was fine. I convinced myself that it was just stress, nothing to be concerned about, but in the back of my mind a nagging feeling was growing. Our conversations had become shorter, and I noticed that she'd sometimes go days without truly engaging with me. It was subtle at first, but over time, it felt like she was becoming more of a stranger. Then there were the moments when she would disappear for hours, running errands or taking a walk. I didn't think much of it at first, but now that I look back, I realize she was creating space, both physically and emotionally, from our life. Those little gaps in her schedule added up, and as I reflect on them, I see them as the first signs of the person she was becoming, a person I no longer recognized. But I never suspected the full extent of what was happening. I thought I was just being paranoid or imagining things. Life, as it seemed, was perfect. Little did I know, Laura had already decided she was going to leave. She just hadn't told me yet. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the phone call came. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and reading the paper. The kids still asleep upstairs. The morning had started like any other, with the usual hum of suburban life, quiet, predictable, safe. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, and it took a few moments for the words to register. "Sir, we regret to inform you that your wife Laura has been involved in a car accident. We need you to come to the hospital immediately." My stomach dropped. I stood up, the coffee mug slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the words I had just heard. Laura? An accident? It didn't make sense. She had left the house that morning, like she always did, without a hint of anything unusual. We had just had breakfast together, for God's sake. She was supposed to be fine. I was barely aware of what I was doing as I rushed to the hospital. My mind was numb, my thoughts scrambled. When I arrived, I was ushered into a sterile waiting room. I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing, the faint sound of beeping monitors from the nearby emergency room, but I couldn't focus on anything. My only thought was Laura. What had happened? Was she okay? The doctor who met me in the hallway was sympathetic but brief. "I'm sorry, sir, but your wife didn't survive the crash." His words were clinical, detached, as if he was simply delivering information, but to me it felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. He passed away at the scene. The impact was too severe. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and I felt as if I had been knocked to my knees even though I was standing. My mind couldn't grasp the enormity of what he was saying. Laura was gone? Just like that? How could this be happening? The following hours were a blur. My mind couldn't keep up with the rush of details that followed. The police arrived asking questions I couldn't even begin to answer. There had been no witnesses to the crash, they said. The accident had occurred on a quiet stretch of road not far from our home. Laura's car had left the road and gone down into a ravine. They weren't sure why she lost control of the vehicle, but there were no signs of foul play or any indication of what had caused it. They showed me photos of the car, twisted metal, broken glass, a crumpled frame. My heart shattered as I saw the remnants of her life, the thing she had been driving only hours before. How could this be? How could this have happened to her, to us? The funeral came quickly, as funerals do, and the house was flooded with mourners. Friends, family, neighbors all came to offer their condolences. They spoke of how kind Laura had been, how devoted she had been to our family. They told me she would be deeply missed, and I couldn't disagree. But inside, I felt nothing but disbelief and a growing sense of confusion. Something was wrong. I knew it. The grief felt real, but it was overshadowed by an unsettling feeling that wouldn't leave me. In the back of my mind, a question lingered. How could someone so full of life, someone so present in our home, be gone in the blink of an eye? It didn't make sense. And as the days passed, that gnawing feeling in my gut only grew stronger. There were gaps in the story, questions left unanswered, and I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just an accident. But I had no proof, not yet. And so, for the moment, I had no choice but to accept the tragedy. The life I thought I knew was gone in an instant. The woman I loved was dead, and I was left to try and make sense of it all while raising two young children who would never understand what had truly happened. 2 months had passed since Laura's funeral. The grief was still fresh, though I had started to force myself to move forward for the sake of our children. The house felt quieter, emptier, as I tried to fill the gaps she had left behind. But every day felt like I was walking through fog. The kids missed her terribly, and I did my best to comfort them, but there was a weight on me that I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something deep inside me told me Laura's death wasn't the accident it seemed to be, and what I'd discovered while thinking made it out of my mind. Then, one morning, everything changed. It was just another day like any other. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I noticed a small envelope sticking out of the pile of bills and letters on the counter. It had no return address, nothing to indicate where it came from. I picked it up, curious. As I held it in my hands, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of unease. It didn't feel like a normal piece of mail. Too small, too unmarked, but I tore it open anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed in an almost frantic, hurried hand. My eyes scanned the words, each sentence sending a cold wave through me. I'm sorry, but you have to know the truth. She's alive. I couldn't keep pretending. Laura's been planning this for months. She faked her death to be with me. I'm the one she's been seeing. We're together now, far away. Please, don't try to find us. At first, I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to process what I had just read. It didn't make sense. I ran my fingers over the paper, rereading the words over and over, trying to understand. But it wasn't possible. Laura was dead. She couldn't be alive. The funeral, the burial, the grief. It had all been so real. How could someone send me something like this? What kind of sick joke was this? My hands were shaking as I put the letter down. I wanted to scream, to throw it across the room, but deep down, something inside me knew it wasn't a joke. There was no reason for someone to write this unless there was truth behind it. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces of Laura's strange behavior in the months before her death began to fall into place. The quiet moments when she would disappear for hours. The odd detachment. The way she seemed emotionally absent at times. It all made sense now. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my wife, I was grieving the lie she had built around me and our family. How could she have done this? How could she have left us all behind without a word? I thought I had known her better than anyone, but I had been blind. I had to know the truth. I had to find out where she was. Who was this person who claimed to be with her? And why was Laura doing this to us? The letter didn't say where they were, but I couldn't ignore the burning need to find her, to confront her, to ask her why. The grief that had been clouding my mind for weeks began to shift into something else. Anger. Betrayal. A deep, aching need for answers. I wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. I was a man with a mission, one that would lead me down a path I never could have predicted. The truth was out there. I just had to find it. I spent the next few days in a haze, combing through every detail I could remember, searching for something that would explain the letter I'd received. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a hoax, a cruel prank that someone had played on me. But as much as I wanted to ignore it, the nagging feeling that the letter was real wouldn't leave me. Every small detail that had seemed insignificant before now felt like a clue. I had to find out what had really happened to Laura. I started by revisiting the police report of the accident. The report had seemed so clean, so final when I had first read it, but now with new eyes I saw the inconsistencies. There were no witnesses to the crash, no one who had seen her car go off the road. The scene had been discovered by a passerby, and the authorities had responded quickly, which was unusual for such a quiet stretch of road. The wreckage was minimal, too minimal for a crash that had supposedly taken a life. There were no signs of Laura's personal items, like her purse or any identification, left in the car. It was as though she had simply disappeared, leaving the wreckage behind as a decoy. The police had brushed off my questions when I brought these details up, explaining that they didn't find anything suspicious. But I wasn't convinced. I needed to know more. I began to dig into Laura's life, looking at old phone records, email accounts, and even social media messages. It felt invasive, like I was betraying her memory, but I couldn't stop. The silence she had maintained in the months leading up to her death now screamed at me. Her phone record showed several calls and messages from an unknown number, mostly late at night when I was asleep or busy with the kids. The number wasn't registered to anyone, and when I tried calling it, it went straight to voicemail. The more I dug, the more I found. I found messages between Laura and someone I didn't know, but the language in the texts was intimate. Too intimate. She had been planning something. I found an email she'd sent just days before her supposed death. It was addressed to someone named Mark, someone I had never heard her mention before. The email was short, cryptic, but the words sent chills down my spine. It's time. Everything is in place. I'll do it tomorrow. My heart raced. Mark? Who was he? The more I searched, the clearer it became. Laura hadn't just been seeing someone. She had been planning to leave me. She had orchestrated her own disappearance. The thought hit me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I hadn't just lost her to an accident. I had lost her to someone else. She had made a choice, and it wasn't me. As I dug deeper, I found more about Mark. He was a man from Laura's past, someone she had known briefly before we met. They had reconnected in the months before the accident. They had been in contact, planning their escape, laying the groundwork for her disappearance. Laura hadn't just died in that accident. She had faked her death, staged it all to start a new life with him. The truth was more gut-wrenching than I could have imagined. She hadn't died in that car crash. She had left me, left our children, without a word, without a trace, to build a new life with a man she had kept hidden from me all along. The betrayal was unbearable, but now I had the evidence. It was time to confront the truth. Every corner I turned, the pieces fell into place, and the picture that emerged was one I couldn't have fathomed. Laura's death had been nothing more than a carefully executed lie, and I was the one left to pick up the broken pieces. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Every time I tried to go back to my normal life, every time I hugged my kids or said, "She's alive. She faked her death to be with me. I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that everything I had believed for the past 2 months was a lie. I had to find out who had written it, and more importantly, whether Laura was really alive. I started by retracing every step of the accident. I contacted the police again, hoping they'd missed something in their initial investigation. I requested the accident report, which was more detailed than I'd remembered but still left many questions unanswered. The police had quickly labeled it as a tragic accident with no foul play involved, but something about it never sat right with me. I went over every single detail, hoping to find a clue that might indicate this was all staged. The wreckage photos stood out. They showed the car in a ravine, the damage consistent with a serious crash, but something about the photos struck me as odd. The car didn't seem to have the usual signs of a high-speed crash. There were no skid marks, no visible signs of panic or evasive maneuvers. The airbags had deployed, but the car itself wasn't as destroyed as I'd expect from such a violent accident. Something didn't add up. I began searching for anyone who might have known more. I dug through Laura's personal belongings, looking for any clues, anything that could point me in the direction of the person she'd been with. The more I searched, the more I uncovered. Emails, phone records, old photos, all showing a side of Laura I hadn't known. She'd been in contact with someone regularly in the months leading up to her death. At first I thought it was just a friend, someone she'd confided in about her struggles. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of messages between Laura and a man I'd never heard of, an old acquaintance from her past, someone I didn't recognize. I started digging into this man, tracking down his history. He had a reputation, wealthy, influential, and known to move around the world. He was often on business trips, his lifestyle extravagant and free. A part of me wanted to believe this was all just a coincidence, but every new piece of information pointed to the same conclusion. Laura had planned her escape with him. I found out where he had been staying during the weeks leading up to the supposed accident, a hotel in a remote area, far from our city. It seemed like the perfect place to hide, to set everything up. As I pieced it all together, I realized the crash had been staged, and Laura had likely faked her death. But why? What was it that drove her to do this? Why would she leave our children behind, abandoned everything we had built, for a new life with a man I'd never even known existed? The truth hit me like a freight train. Laura hadn't just left me, she had orchestrated everything, including her own death, so she could disappear with him. The final piece fell into place when I found flight records that showed Laura had left the country on a private plane shortly after the accident. They had gone somewhere far away to live the life she had dreamed of, a life without the responsibilities she'd been trying to escape. I confronted her, though the words were too much for me to process. She admitted everything, how she had fallen out of love, how she had met this man, and how he had promised her a new life away from the confines of marriage and motherhood. She didn't regret her decision. She told me she was free now, and that I would never see her again. I was left with a shattered heart, 2 children to raise, and the painful reality that the woman I had loved for so long was gone, perhaps never truly there at all. The betrayal was more than just emotional. It was deep, personal, and far-reaching, and as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The truth had finally come to light, and while it wasn't what I had hoped for, it was the answer I had been searching for all along. After everything unraveled, life didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, had left us behind, vanished into the life she had so carefully planned. I was left with the remnants of a family that felt incomplete, a home that now echoed with the absence of the person who had once filled every corner with warmth and certainty. Raising our children alone became my sole focus. But it was a struggle. The kids were confused, lost, and they needed answers I couldn't provide. I tried to shield them from the truth as best as I could, but I could see the cracks forming. They asked about their mother, why she wasn't coming back, why she had chosen to leave. It broke my heart each time I saw the sadness in their eyes, knowing that I couldn't give them the closure they deserved. I didn't know what had driven Laura to abandon everything. to choose a life with someone else. There were no words she could offer to make that make sense. Okay. The days turned into months, and I began to rebuild, piece by piece, what had been shattered. But the scars of betrayal didn't heal easily. Every day I fought to keep my focus on the future. There were moments when I'd catch myself reminiscing about our life together, the good times and the way things used to be. But those moments became fewer, overshadowed by the cold reality of what had happened. In the end, I realized that the truth, as painful as it was, had set me free. Laura had made her choice, and though I would never understand why, I knew I had to move on. The past was gone, and all that remained was a future I had to build alone, for myself and for our children.